Hello and welcome back to my channel. Bonsoir et bienvenue sur ma chaîne. And this evening I will be doing a short but sweet review for The War of the Worlds by H.G. Wells. I don't really think I need to introduce this seminal work of science fiction, but out of principle, this is basically the story of a Martian invasion taking place in England at the turn of the 19th to 20th century. And, well, the whole work of H.G. Wells is pretty much considered to be OG science fiction, as it were. And at the time, it was also considered to be a novel of invasion fiction. I learned this in the introduction. It was a whole subgenre of literature at the time in which this was written. The way the novel is structured, it's a straightforward narrative. It's told as a fictitious memoir. The main character is recounting the invasion of the Martians and what happened to the people in and around London and the countryside, etc. It's a fairly short novel, as you can see, and the chapters are also fairly short, so it reads very quickly, which I enjoyed. It strengthens the impression that this is highly action-packed, but also quite thoughtful. Writing-wise, I found H.G. Wells' style to be fairly concise and straight to the point, and I like that. Some might consider it dry, perhaps. It doesn't really go into florid descriptions or anything like that, though sometimes you will write a lengthier paragraph that goes into like scientific world building to explain the physiology and the physiognomy of the Martians and trying to explain how the Martians could have shot across space to come to Earth and things like that. You can definitely sense H.G. Wells' own scientific training and background during those passages, but they worked. Now, this is definitely not a novel you will read for the characters. You have one main character who is the narrator of the story, and he's basically a philosopher who, well, writes papers about philosophy for a living, is married, and he has a brother whom he talks about recounting his journey out of London and out of England. But so the story is told exclusively from his point of view, and there's not much to say about him, really. He does feel very human in his reactions and emotions. You can easily identify with him. Although I will say this, since he is a philosopher, he does stand above what you would consider the masses as well, which of course then serves as a perfect device to extrapolate on the more sciencey and thoughtful bits of the story. So yeah, it was fine, but obviously this is not going to shine with this character work because that's not the point of the story. And, well, I mean, all the science fiction is known not to care that much about the character work, and this is very old science fiction. World-building wise, one must keep in mind that this was written towards the very end of the 19th century. As such, we've obviously come a long way in our understanding of technology, the universe, physics, biology, etc. But still, for the time, this has actually pretty decent world building. I mean, alright, the Martians come to Earth by being shot from ginormous cannons on the planet Mars, which seem a bit fanciful to a more contemporary eye. But still, you can, I guess, appreciate the reasoning behind that. And besides, on the other hand, he kind of foresaw future technology with heat rays, which are kind of like lasers, and poisonous gas, which can perhaps remind you of like the mustard gas used during the World Wars. And the biology of the Martians was fairly interesting to read about. H.G. Wells, like I said, had training in biology and perhaps more specifically medical biology, so the description of the anatomy of the Martians was interesting and did make sense knowing what they knew at the time in any case. And I did enjoy the fact that the tech the Martians used, the juxtaposition between like organic matter and highly developed technology, I like that. Basically, it's biotech the Martians are using, which you see in the Steven Spielberg adaptation. So that was neat. And was definitely groundbreaking for the time, I would assume. And finally, this is something I really loved when I saw the movie adaptation, which I saw years before I picked this up. And it's because of that adaptation that I decided, I'm going to read the source material. I love the fact that it's not the might of humanity that brings down the Martians. No, it is the lowly bacteria. They die from, what the peoples colonized by Europeans died of, which is disease. Diseases which they just weren't immune to, and that's what takes them down. They just die through no action of humans. It's just fate. No, it's not fate, it's nature. But I really love that. But that, of course, makes sense and links directly to the themes which I will now elaborate upon. So I think the main idea running through this novel is that human beings need to get off their high horses, basically. We should be a bit more humble, accept that we don't understand everything about the universe, and that despite appearances, sure, we might be at the top of the food chain, but we are still part of said food chain, and we're not the greatest things ever. Another species comes from another planet and smacks us in the face really hard. And there's direct analogies to the way the Martians exterminate humans and the way humans exploit nature and exterminate vermin, or even exploit animals for food, and the way humans treat one another based on, differences in skin color, etc. So from the little I know about H.G. Wells, I do believe he was a socialist. He was in favor of women's rights and just very humanistic ideals in general. And you can definitely see that, the way he seems to express compassion for lowlier life forms, or at least, that's the thoughts he puts into his main character's head. So human beings need to calm down, be humble, recognize that we can be squashed like ants by something from outer space, or, maybe by diseases we can't fight against, things like that. And then perhaps, but I might be stretching it a bit, to be honest, a sub-theme could be that hyper-cerebralization and hyper-intellectualization isn't good, linked to an obsession with hygiene and being disconnected from the material world and nature more generally, because the Martians are basically described as being these big, blobby brains on tentacles. And there's a discussion going on about how that would be the logical next step for human evolution if we just focus on our brain power and continue being disconnected from our bodily cells and our senses, etc. So I don't know. I could be reading too much into this, but I read that as, it's a commentary on the fact that we're just being too separate from the rest of nature, from the rest of life on Earth, and being too obsessed with this excessively pure and clean, hyper-cerebral sphere of functioning that isn't balanced with the rest of our existence. But that's just how I read it. And before I leave off, I will read a few quotes I wrote down from the novel, especially to underscore that point about H.G. Wells comparing the plight of humans to the plight we impose on our fellow creatures. And before we judge of them too harshly, we must remember what ruthless and utter destruction our own species has wrought, not only upon animals, such as the vanished bison and the dodo, but upon its own inferior races. That little element isn't ideal. We're all agreed on that, but still, I think it's a pretty interesting quote. I felt the first inkling of a thing that presently grew quite clear in my mind, that oppressed me for many days, a sense of dethronement, a persuasion that I was no longer a master, but an animal among the animals, under the Martian heel. Surely, if we have learnt nothing else, this war has taught us pity for those witless souls that suffer our dominion. It may be that in the larger design of the universe, this invasion from Mars is not without its ultimate benefit for men. It has robbed us of that serene confidence in the future, which is the most fruitful source of decadence. The gifts to human science it has brought are enormous, and it has done much to promote the conception of the common weal of mankind. So overall, it was a very short novel. It was about 186 pages, but I really liked it. I really liked it. I gave it a solid 7 out of 10. I didn't expect to enjoy it that much because I already knew the basic plot. And yeah, some of the science is outdated, obviously, but it read very quickly. There was a lot of action, but also very thoughtful bits. So now, yeah, it was a very enjoyable read. And I will say this, as I mentioned, I saw the Steven Spielberg adaptation years ago now. And yeah, you know, he Hollywoodized it a bit by placing it in America with, it was either Tom Cruise or Brad Pitt, I can't remember, as the main character, and big explosions and destruction, etc. And fine, I mean, the original story takes place in England, in the countryside around London and in London. But actually, from what I can remember of the movie, it was a fairly decent adaptation because Spielberg managed to put scenes that are in the book into the movie, changing them slightly, but I could recognize some scenes from the book in the movie with slightly different characters, obviously, but most of the major elements were still there. And like I said, that major element of it's the bacteria that kill off the aliens, stupid little puny humans had nothing to do with it. I love that. And this week I will be reading another seminal work of SFF, Frankenstein by Mary Shelley, and I'll of course report back to you on that one. But until then, I hope you all have a lovely day, evening, whichever, and I shall see you in the next video. Bye bye.